Well, welcome back. For this unit on teaching grammar, we've diverged from the Harmer textbook and turned to a chapter of another textbook, this one by Diane Larson Freeman. So you should have read that chapter before watching this video lecture. If you haven't had a chance to read, just go ahead and pause the video, read the chapter, come on back. Larson Freeman is one of the gurus in the field of ESL grammar teaching. And she begins her chapter with three key questions that we're going to consider. The first of her reflective questions is simply, what is grammar? How is grammar learned? And how is grammar taught? Think about these questions, perhaps as you might have answered them if you hadn't studied TESL at all, if you hadn't had any training in teaching English language learners. How would you describe what grammar is, how we learn it, and how we teach it? Well, we'll take Larson Freeman's first question and she explains that there are basically two kinds of grammar, or two ways of approaching what grammar is. Linguists talk about prescriptive grammar, like a prescription. This is, you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you what kind of medicine you should take. So this is the way that a language sort of ought to be used. It's the rules that we have that tell us the way we should talk and the way that we should write. It's probably more important in academic language than it is in, say, casual conversation. And the little image I have there is a badge of the grammar police to serve and correct. People who love prescriptive grammar are very committed to rules for things, the way that things should be. However, there's another way that linguists talk about how we approach grammar, and that's descriptive grammar. So this acknowledges the fact that we say lots of things that don't conform to the prescriptive grammar rules, and we still understand their meaning. We still understand the message that that person was trying to say, even if it doesn't exactly follow the rules that we might have in our grammar textbooks. We call this descriptive because we're describing the way that language is used more than following a prescription for how language ought to be used. It recognizes that there's always variation in language usage. So a couple examples of what this maybe looks like. My husband, for example, will frequently talk about Annie and I's car. Annie and I's car. Well, a prescriptive grammarian would say, no. We don't talk about Annie and I's car. We would talk about Annie's and my car. That's the correct construction of that possessive noun phrase, Annie's and my car. The first is something that a descriptive grammarian would say, well, sure, it doesn't follow the rules per se, but we understand what's being communicated here. Whereas the prescriptive grammarian would say, no, it just should not be phrased that way. Or you often might hear people talk about, come with Jenny and I. Come with Jenny and I. Well, the prescriptive grammarian would say, no, you would come with Jenny and me. Come with Jenny and me. Or the opposite, Jenny and me are getting a pizza. Well, the prescriptive grammarian would say, no, Jenny and I are getting a pizza. It's a confusion of the subject and the object in those sentences. But a descriptive grammarian would say that switching them up doesn't really matter because people use language this way all the time and we understand what they mean. So I just wanted to present, there's a couple of different ways I'm thinking about grammar that Larson Freeman describes. Larson Freeman gives us her definition of grammar on page 258. She says that grammar is a system of lexicogrammatical patterns that are used to make meaning in appropriate ways. But that definition may not help us too much unless we break down the words. So first, lexico. Whenever you see anything referring with that prefix lex, that's just referring to words. The lexicon, our lexical capacity, these have to do with the words that we know and the words that we use. Grammatical just refers to the way that words work with other words, the way that we put words together and make them work together to communicate. Patterns. Patterns are repeated and predictable ways that we use these words together to ultimately make meaning or communicate a message to other people who share those same lexicogrammatical patterns. In response to Larson Freeman's second question about the learning process of grammar, from research on how people acquire a second language, we now know a number of important things about the way that learners acquire second language grammar. So the first thing that we know is that learners don't learn constructions or grammar patterns one at a time. They may be able to use, say, the definite article, the word the, in one context totally appropriately, but they might not be able to do this consistently. So you might hear the same learner say something like, the girl runs very fast. She is fastest runner. Well, in the first sentence, they use the definite article totally appropriately, the girl, the specific girl that I'm talking about. She is fastest runner. Well, here they dropped the definite article where they should say she is the fastest runner because it's a specific most fast runner. They've left it off. So we'll see that it's not as if a person acquires one construction, completely masters it, and then moves on to the next. We will see that errors occur even when learners appear to have mastered that particular construction. So another example is that they might overgeneralize the third person singular marker on present tense verbs. So putting the S when saying she wants to go, and applying it where it doesn't belong. So modal verbs like can, could, would, might, those don't take that S. We don't say she cans speak Spanish, even though you normally would put an S after a verb for third person singular. Those don't apply to modals. And so a person might have learned that we add that S and apply it to modals in a way that doesn't belong there. That's an exception to the rule when it comes to modals. So you'll see that errors occur even when it seems like they've mastered a construction. We'll talk more about how we can build on first language on the first language next week when we talk about, in the next unit when we talk about second language acquisition. But we know that in terms of how second language grammar is learned, language learners rely on the knowledge and experience that they already have. So they use their first language, their L1, and any other languages that they know to hypothesize about how the L2 works. So if they know grammar constructions and grammar rules in their own language or other languages that they know, they're going to make hypotheses or assumptions about their new language, about English, based on what the languages that they already know. So we'll be looking at examples of that when we talk about second language acquisition. But we also have to recognize that different learning processes are responsible for different aspects of language. So our brains are doing a lot of different processes when we're learning languages. There's a lot of pattern recognition that's happening. They're seeing that their different rules apply in regular ways and patterns, and parts of their brain are being activated that way. They're making associations or connections between things that they're learning in language, and they're also discriminating. They're learning to tell the difference between things that are different than what they would have expected from their first language and their second language. So we have to really respect that these complicated things are happening in language learners' brains. And so in answer to Larson Freeman's third question about how grammar ought to be taught, based on what we just saw in terms of how L2 grammar is learned, we can draw some classroom applications. So Stephen Krashen in 1982 said that maybe grammar doesn't need to be taught explicitly at all. So he said, if learners have enough comprehensible input, that I+1 that we've talked about in the past, that um, level of language that's just above what the learner currently understands, if they have enough of that comprehensible input, the necessary grammar will be unconsciously acquired, just like children learn their first language grammar. So parents don't sit their toddlers down and explain to them that we put an ed ending on verbs that are in the simple past tense. We don't explain that to our kids. They just hear enough examples of verbs with ed endings referring to things that happened in the past, and they unconsciously acquire an understanding of that rule. And then they start to use it. No one explains it. They just have enough of this input that it is a rule that becomes acquired and used. And Krashen said that L2 learners should be able to do the exact same thing without being explicitly taught. However, many other theorists would disagree and say that, that's a great concept if a person had all the time in the world to just be in a language-rich environment in which they're learning their second language. However, since class time and exposure to the second language may be limited simply to the classroom and not happening in other parts of a person's life, some amount of focused and explicit attention to grammar is desirable in order to accelerate that natural acquisition of grammar. So we may not even need to use sort of grammatical terminology, but we're going to want to point out how the grammar works. So we might not need to use phrases like regular simple past tense, but we do need to say, now we play, yesterday we played. Now we laugh, yesterday we laughed. And pointing out those differences in ways that are meaningful can be helpful for our learners to explicitly learn these. Otherwise, some of these non-native constructions or errors in grammar can become fossilized, which means that if an error isn't corrected, eventually, sometimes it becomes so ingrained that it can't be changed by the learner. Well, one of the approaches that we've read about in Harmer is presented as a tried and true approach to grammar teaching in Larson Freeman as well, and that's PPP, or present, practice, produce. So the first present, we give an understanding of the grammar rule to students. Sometimes this is by pointing out the differences between the L1 and the L2. So often giving some kind of presentation of the rule is the important place to start. Then we give our students an opportunity to practice, to do some controlled practice, something like oral drills where they're repeating those phrases over and over. Maybe it's written exercises. This allows students to proceduralize their knowledge, to practice again and again that grammar point until it becomes more automatic. They automatize the rule so they don't have to think about it so consciously every time they want to use words with words that way. And finally, produce. Production activities are those opportunities for communicative use. They are intended to promote automatic and accurate use of the grammar by giving students an opportunity for freer expression than controlled practice. So I'm going to show you some examples of each of those P's. The first is an example of present, and it's a simple presentation of future aspect of verbs. So this is a PDF that you're going to find in the folder of grammar activities on D2L, and all of the examples I'm going to share in this lecture are available in that folder. I highly recommend you take the time to look through those, as they're going to give you good ideas for how to teach grammar, as well as for your major assignment on teaching grammar. So this is a simple explanation of how to use be plus going to refer to future time. So you can see at the top that students have already learned the patterns for simple present and present continuous. So they've already learned I read every day, I am reading now. And the new pattern that the teacher is presenting, probably up on the board or maybe on a worksheet or with the use of some kind of anchor chart, is the future construction. So in this clear table, we see on the left that there's first, second, and third person singular. So I am going to read tomorrow. You are going to read tomorrow. He is going to read tomorrow. And this would be aided as well by maybe some pairing it with images that demonstrate the difference between each of those singular nouns. So I am going to read tomorrow, you are going to read tomorrow, he is going to read tomorrow. And then we move down and we see first, second, and third person plural. We are going to read tomorrow, you are going to read tomorrow, they are going to read tomorrow. And the teacher might point out that really most of them are the same, are going to read tomorrow, except for I and he, she, it, for is going to read tomorrow. So this would be a way to present that construction before going on to some controlled practice and then ultimately some production activities. So this would be an example of present. Next, an example of the practice stage. We're going to look at one simple game that can be used to practice prepositions of place. So you'll see this image, it's got several cute little cats that are in different places in the picture. And the teacher has already presented to students how we use different prepositions of place. Now we're going to have them work in pairs by themselves doing a practice activity like this one. So students must decide if, for example, cat number 2 is in the boot, on the boot, around the boot, under the boot, etc. And perhaps you provide some scaffolding, something like a word bank that provides those prepositions of place that have already been taught, under, across, below, on top of, in, etc. So that's an example of some controlled practice. For an example of produce, we are going to look at a communicative activity that involves conversation cards for practicing the use of modal verbs. So again, in produce, you are looking to have a more open-ended opportunity for students to use the grammar construction in meaningful ways. So here's just some conversation cards, and you could cut them up and hand them out to small groups or pairs to discuss the questions. And the idea here is to generate conversation that uses modal verbs. So these verbs, would, could, should, might, may, can, will. We use them in a variety of ways in English. And those have already been presented. The students have already done a lot of controlled practice using these different verbs correctly. And now they're given an opportunity to communicate about themselves and each other using these kinds of verbs meaningfully. So name 3 things you may not do in this class. What are some things you should have done last week but did not do? How would you recommend treating a cold? And so this gives students some sort of conversation prompts to communicatively produce these modal verbs in meaningful ways. So those are some examples of PPP. An alternative to PPE is the approach called focus on form, introduced by Long in 1991. He said that instead of teaching a long list of grammatical constructions in a kind of preemptive PPP way, we should have students focus on content and tasks with language. And only digress to teaching grammar points when issues or errors with grammar arise. And we're going to talk more about task-based and content-based language teaching in an upcoming unit. But he said that it's better to take a reactive than a preemptive approach when it comes to to grammar, so that learners are primarily engaged in communication and only briefly digress to grammar when necessary. So you focus on content and you focus on tasks that they can do with language. And then when learners make an error, you stop and have a mini lesson on that form. Some ways that you can do focus on form include enhancing input. So maybe you have a reading passage and their specific forms, grammatical forms, are highlighted in boldface type. So if you're wanting to teach students, again, maybe those ed endings on verbs, you put those in boldface to sort of help students to especially notice those forms, or maybe even in the way that the teacher stresses those forms when speaking. So putting particular emphasis on the grammatical form that she's using when doing a speaking activity. Another way to do focus on form is with input flooding. So making sure to choose texts with frequent examples of a particular grammatical construction to promote noticing and enhance their saliency. I'll show you an example of these in just a moment. Another example of focus on form would include input processing. So this is when you would focus on the properties of a language during activities where the structure that's being used meaningfully, there are differences between the first language and the second language. This can be especially useful when focusing on things like word order that changes the meaning of the sentence in English, but it doesn't change the meaning in another language, perhaps like Spanish. So this is the example in the Larson-Freeman chapter. We have the sentence, "The man is looking for you," and then the sentence, "You are looking for the man." So the subject and the object in this sentence being in a different place very much changes the meaning of the sentence in English. However, the same sentences in Spanish, "Te busca el señor" and "Tú buscas el señor," the meaning of those sentences is different, but the word order is about the same. The words are slightly different, but you'll see the meaning of the first one, the man is looking for you, "Te busca el señor." The word order is similar, even if the meaning changes to "you are looking for the man." Tú buscas al señor. And please forgive my Spanish. So it might be useful to really explicitly, in input processing, point out the differences between these. And sometimes it can be helpful to have pictures to accompany the differences, to show students, have them imagine that they're in the picture, tell the difference between the two phrases. So I'm going to give you an example of input flooding. You're going to see here, this is an example of trying to teach students the difference between adjectives that have an ed form and an ing form, adjectives like amazed and amazing, or interested and interesting. So a funny image like this can make clear the explanation of the difference between adjectives that have an ed version and an ing version. So she says, "Interested you may be, but you're not interesting." So this man is interested, but the woman doesn't find him interesting. And it can be helpful to use something like this to teach students the difference between the fact that people may feel amazed and the cause is something amazing. They may feel excited and the cause is something exciting, etc. More input flooding with that same construction of ed and ig ending adjectives would be to, say, give students a short reading passage and have them notice, have them underline all of the adjectives that express emotions. So Yesterday was a school holiday. Of course, it rained all day, so my kids were really bored. I wanted to do some work at home, but they interrupted me every 5 minutes and just became too annoying. I am amazed and astonished that their teachers are not constantly exhausted. So, and it goes on. So students would underline all of those ed and ing adjectives, and then it asks them to identify the source or the person who feels the emotion. So the first one is identified as the kids are bored. And what are they bored by? Well, they're bored by the rainy school holiday. So they are bored, and the rainy holiday is boring. Then the children became annoying. The children are annoying, so the mother is annoyed. And they begin to identify that the person who feels the emotion has the ed adjective, and the source of that emotion has the ing ending. So when we think about teaching grammar, it's also important to consider how we're going to respond when students use grammatical constructions incorrectly. So when providing students corrective feedback on grammatical errors, it's important to choose the right moment to do so. And that's usually not going to be during communicative activities where the focus should be on fluency, not accuracy. And we don't want to inhibit students' confidence. We can come back to the point later, either with the individual or sometimes as a whole group mini lesson if everyone would benefit from that correction. We also have to remember that students may not incorporate the correct form immediately, but it does help students to either reject or modify their hypothesis about the construction they're using and how to use the form correctly that they had tried. There are a few ways to provide unobtrusive corrective feedback. One is a recast, so reformulating correctly what a student has said incorrectly. So, I go to the store last week. Oh, you went to the store? Yes, I went to the store last week. Another is self-correction. So sometimes you repeat what was said up to the point of the error and let the student self-correct from there. So my mom no likes pizza. Your mom, my mom doesn't like pizza. That's right. Sometimes it can be helpful to give an explicit rule. And when it comes to giving an explicit rule, some teachers sort of collect the most common errors that they hear their students or see their students making, and then teach that explicit rule in an anonymous fashion so no one feels singled out. So if you're constantly hearing something like, Jenny walked to school every day, then you're going to want to maybe point out to students altogether, we put an S sound on she or he or it verbs, so that we would say Jenny walks to school every day. Jenny walks to school every day. Well, that is all on teaching grammar, so make sure you have a look at the task list for details on all the activities for Unit 6, and I will see you next time.